Daniels with us who made this event possible. The focus of this annual event is to drive discourse in sustainability and system design, areas Lucas was very passionate about. Lucas Daniels' series of sustainable systems hosts speakers who can address topics that will benefit from systems thinking and systems design. Lucas, I need to note, was among the pioneers in his interest and practice of using design approaches and competencies to address sustainability over 5 years ago, 6 years ago even. It is now has become one of our ID's key foci as part of our mission of building more cooperative, intelligent, sustainable futures. Today, we're honored to have Gretchen Bakke join us to discuss the grid, on which she published in 2006 the book, The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Future, which Bill Gates declared as one of his favorite books. I'm sure, Gretchen, that helped your book sales probably quite a bit, and it's well deserved. Gretchen is a cultural anthropologist for which she holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. So she's part fellow Chicagoan. She currently is a visiting professor of anthropology at the Integrative Research Institute on Transformations of Human Environment Systems at the Humboldt University in Berlin. For the past decade, Gretchen has been researching and writing about the changing culture of electricity in the United States. Our conversation today will begin with Gretchen giving us a background on her work. We have 3 expert panelists that will all then bring different entry points. Mohammad Shahidehpour, director of the Robert Galvin Center for Electricity Innovation at IIT, will then share his insights, including information about IIT's own microgrid and Biden's, the new president's, energy plan. We are very glad and excited to have this event as a collaborative event between ID and the Galvin Center. I think it's probably the first collaborative event we're having, and hopefully one of many. Then ID faculty Weslynne Ashton, Professor of Environmental Management and Sustainability, and Carlos Teixeira, Professor of Design and Systems Thinking, will then join the conversation to help us better understand design's critical role in reimagining this deeply important civic infrastructure. The panelists will address questions towards the end of the session. Please add your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat, to the Q&A section in the Zoom panel. And yes, the event will be recorded, and we will share the recordings with registrants latest by tomorrow. So now it's my pleasure and honor to pass the mic on to Gretchen. Gretchen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis, for the kind introduction, and also to Weslynne and Carlos for thinking of me and inviting me here to talk about electricity networks, grids, which are, as you mentioned, kind of my thing. So I think of grids, and again, as an anthropologist, as ever-changing infrastructures, right? Not as static, but as alive with culture and also alive with us. As we change, they change. And this has always been true. It's especially true right now. For it is widely agreed that the 2020s will be the decisive decade, in quotes, everybody's using this phrase now, decisive decade, to quote, fix global warming. The lowest hanging fruit in this process of fixing global warming, quite the phrase, right, is greening the electricity system. What this means is that if you convert the grid, the electric grid, to 100% renewables, mostly these days that means solar, wind, hydro, you can't see my hand, there we go, solar, wind, hydro, in some places geothermal where that's available, tidal power coming up, right? And also some say nuclear, there's a lot of debate about that, but if you essentially pull the fossil fuels out of the electricity system, you make great strides toward carbon neutrality. Great strides, totally insufficient to fixing global warming, right? But nevertheless, a very, very good beginning. So to make green electrification possible, there are some substantial engineering, design, regulatory, and policy problems to solve. And up until about last week, the policy problems were actually the most intractable. Now, however, as we all know, we have a new president. I want to say thank you to Georgia. I want to say that every time I mention the fact that we have a new president. And his infrastructure plans call for a carbon-free power sector by 2030. So it is indeed a decisive decade. Important is this: our power sector was designed to run on fossil fuels. Pull these fuels out and everything changes. The details of this everything change, to borrow a phrase from Margaret Atwood, will be my endpoint, so we'll get there. First, though, I wanted to take you back to the electrical outlet. Right, not everything changed, but back to a place where we can see how important the small things forgotten are to revolutionizing something as big and unwieldy as a continent-spanning electricity system. The wall outlet, the one we know, was standardized first in the first half of 1929. 1929, months before the stock market crash. It was the last year of disposable household income in the US, the last year before the choking poverty of the Great Depression. 1929 was also about 30 years into electrification. Electricity by 1929 was something known and increasingly commonplace in the US. Using it, however, to power household appliances was insanely complicated. And nobody ever talks about this, which is why I'm bringing it up today, right? There were literally hundreds of different wall outlets and plugs to fit them of every possible sort, right? People were not inventing appliances because other people couldn't buy them. They couldn't run them, not because of poverty, not because they didn't want refrigerators, but because they all plugged, every appliance plugged into the wall differently. And nobody wanted to rewire their house just to have a refrigerator and an electric flat iron. What everyone used instead were these things that screw into light bulbs. The first of these was called the Edison screw, which sounds like a cocktail. Maybe one of those things to work on, right? The Edison screw. And shortly, about 20 years later, Harvey Hubble invented the separable attachment plug, which had a less cool name, less sexy name in the early 1900s. Harvey Hubble also invented the on-off pull switch. So if you've ever turned a light on and off like this, that was also Hubble. So the separable attachment plug, as you can see here, is something we still used a lot when I was a kid, actually, which is an outlet that screws into a light fixture. And this is because people who had electricity in their houses often only had a light fixture, one, in the middle of a room. And the plug then, which as you can see here, really does look like the outlet that we use today with these two tines in parallel, flat tines in parallel, then allowed you to plug stuff into your wall, into your bulb outlet. So the lack of a standardized outlet meant that for the first 30 years or so of household electrification, life looked a lot like this. And I'm not sure if in this picture you can see it because of the way that the Zoom works, but in these you certainly can. You had a cord that is here. These are all staged images, but from Scientific American 1904. But you have a cord that then plugs into this little screw into the light. You don't have a light simultaneously. So here we have the electric chafing dish, the electric hot water bottle, the electric heated flat iron, and the electric curling iron heater, but all of them have the same shape, the same basic look, which is this dangly cord. So more common than this, the images that we have here, these staged images, is something we don't have any pictures of, which is this single light fixture in the middle of the ceiling, which made the cord even more awkward than what you see right here. And also it meant that you had to stand up on a chair. So you imagine these ladies in their puffy dresses, standing up on chairs to unscrew the bulb and screw in the electric iron. The electric iron was the principal and often sole household appliance up until the 1940s. So this, what we think of as the appliance boom, it was pretty much just electric irons for the first almost 50 years of household electrification, light and electric irons. In 1901, as context, there were only 18 refrigerators in all of Manhattan. And a decade later, in 1910, though there were close to 45,000 electric appliances in Southern California, 80% of these were electric irons, and all of them screwed into light sockets. Thus, the appliance boom that gave shape to the modern electrified household we find so familiar today came both after the Depression and notably after the standardized outlet. So here's the 1940s outlet, which you can see really bears a lot in common with our sort of 2020 outlet. It doesn't have a ground. And these 2020 outlets are sort of made to look sad and shocked, right? The sad and shocked outlet face. Since the 1940s, in other words, so sort of since the time when this was the outlet that you would find in people's walls, many things have been stable in our electricity system. The plugs, the outlets, the voltages. So in the US, it's 110 volts on our system. Current, AC current, which has been standard since the 1890s, are sort of the foremost among all of these things. The reason I'm telling you this long story about outlets and plugs is because I'm struck by the visual similarity of a design problem that we suffer from today. And so here you see it, right? The plug-in electric vehicle. 100 years have gone by and you can still see the electric grid when it's bursting its confines. It's not always doing this, right? But you can see it when it does. And you can see it here in precisely the same way. These cables, they signal a need and a design opportunity, not just the design for an outlet or a plug, but a design that enables a future way of living with power, right? So this is not just a design issue. At issue, what we see right here at issue is that fossil fuels need to go. It's a sustainability issue. They will go. And that gives us this new intersection between something that drives around and an electricity system based on cables. Here's another image, right? And I've circled over here in the corner the adapter, right? This is sort of the Hubble adapter of the present moment, right? That this car is using, right? So this right here, this circle, this sort of turquoise circle, is us trying to work out the nitty-gritty of a sustainable energy system, right? And we might call this the moment of ridiculous adapters. So think as you walk around in your life, look for the ridiculous adapters, because that is a place that you can see people, inventors, designers, and also engineers struggling to figure out a way to make this system green, right? To get the fossil fuels out of a system that was made to run on fossil fuels. And also that the grid then begins to extend out to these things it was never meant to power. So a thing made of cords is now trying to run a bunch of stuff that drives around, right? And so the problem, this actually really perfectly captures the problem. The moment of ridiculous adapters. So here's one more story of us pushing the grid, pushing at the grid. This is an LED Yoda lamp that my kid got for his birthday in 2017. He was then 6. So already this is the past, 2017. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but you will see that we've actually changed things in remarkable ways since then. It came, this Yoda lamp, it came with a power cable that only had a USB connection. This is the picture from the back of the box. And it shows it, hopefully my face is not in front of this little thing, but if you look on the corner where it says USB, It shows that this Yoda lamp's USB is plugged into a computer. One presumes then that the computer is plugged into the wall outlet, so that the computer here is essentially working as an adapter for a 110 volt AC grid provided electrical system to a 5 volt DC system, which is not currently supported by the grid. By not currently supported, I just mean it needs a translation device, a thing that allows for interoperability. And this is a really important word at present, right? Using one of these things, can you see this? Oh no, I just am gonna disappear. Using a computer, so I was gonna show you a computer, right? To translate between power systems is a pretty awkward workaround, and not to mention expensive to leave in a kid's room, given that one of the things that kids do really well is break stuff. So I was stunned when we got this thing. He was super excited. He had his new Yoda lamp, and I was supposed to leave a computer in his room at 6 years old so that he could run his Yoda lamp, right? This was the design of the product. Luckily, however, right, I had one of these, which I'm sure you all do as well today. This is a European one because I'm currently in Germany, but a little USB adapter from IKEA, 3 little holes, right? It's crazy to think that in 2017, the makers of a USB powered thing presumed that the customer had a computer, but did not presume that the customer had a 5 volt DC AC adapter. Today, some outlets, not very many, but some outlets also have USB ports built in. I'm guessing that even if you don't have a Yoda lamp, you do have a device or another sort of thing, a cell phone that needs an adapter like this, right? So the point is that this is a 5 volt DC system. Our electricity system we've been using for 100 years is a 110 volt AC system. This is the back of the Yoda lamp. What probably a few of you have understood, and I certainly did not understand before I got the Yoda lamp, even though I've been working on electricity systems for almost 10 years at that point, right? Is that we are in the process of developing a parallel electricity system on the user's end. For now, that parallel system looks like a 5 volt DC system. But in sort of a funny way, the specifics of this parallel system don't really matter that much, because with what's happening right now to the grid, we can have several or maybe even a lot of parallel, overlapping, alternative, and not the same electricity systems, as long as they happen within some kind of envelope that can be linked up to the grid, that can be interoperable with the grid. For right now, that envelope often looks like a building. Signs thus point to the development of an electricity system where a building's edge marks the break between a larger grid with a set of norms and standards for operation, like 110 volt AC power, and an electricity system inside a building, which can work in any number of ways. What matters only is that there is interoperability between the system in the building and the larger grid. Right, and here I've got the point of connection, right, in bubble of 1. On the left-hand side, the point of connection is actually the service wire from your utility. And this circle also has the meter inside of it. But you can think of this house as a bubble or something with sort of a thick skin on it. And you can do all kinds of things inside this house that, as long as it's interoperable at this point of connection to the larger electricity system, you can have a lot of flexibility, inventiveness. What's nice about DC systems, which may or may not become normal, is that they won't kill you if you play with them or touch them or work on them or tinker them yourself. So they have a kind of promise for the DIY community. But there's all kinds of things you can do inside of a house right now, as long as the interconnectability works. You also have a bubble of 7. So this is a transformer on the pole. This is a distribution pole, so a small neighborhood, fairly low voltage pole. And a transformer in the US usually connects 7 houses, or 7 meters. It doesn't have to be a house, but let's say 7 meters. And that means that you can also start to think about a bubble of 7. You could have, for example, on the roof of one house, solar panels, in the basement of another house, a battery system. You could have 3 other houses that are simply sort of signed up to use this, to use the solar power that is generated or the stored power that is stored from the others. This has been called a solar safety net, but in Australia, it's also been called swarm electrification. In Australia, they make it look like a honeycomb, but essentially the idea is that you can begin to organize at a very local level because of how we're thinking about making power locally, but also because of the shape of the existing electricity system. You can organize creativity at certain juncture points, and this is just 2 of them. There are others. So bubble of 1 often goes by the term nanogrid, and I've given you one here. This is a household sized grid, a single meter is what it would be. Bubble of 7 or lots more than that, a phone grid, and I've given you an idea of how you could actually have not just 7 meters connected to each other, serving each other, working together as a kind of little electrical community, but the way in which that can be linked into a much larger electrical grid that looks like, let me take that back, that functions like the 20th century grid, but the underlying geography, geometry, and functionality of that grid is radically different than what we had in the 20th century. So this is just for fun called the phone grid, right? So this kind of thinking allows us to conceive of the big grid differently, as an example of a union of interoperable, smaller scale energy systems with their own means of supplying and managing their energy needs. Or at a slightly larger scale, that of the microgrid, which you have at IIT, extending outward to larger Bronzeville community, and we'll talk about in a minute, right? This is also a way of creating a kind of energy security or energy island. Whether speaking of micros or nanos, the shift seems to be away from a vertically integrated monopoly utility system toward one in which electricity is made and used locally by smaller scale entities that can connect and thus constitute a larger electrical system that works like the 20th century grid, or that can disconnect from it and work independently. I've gotten this far, which is to say almost to the end, without showing you the traditional image of a grid, and I've done this on purpose. The traditional image is the schemata you get if you Google electric grid, and here it is now. And I've done this so that you can understand how developments in the present give rise to something else, maybe not foam, but certainly not a world where your car plugs in through your 2nd-story window, nor one where your computer serves as a 5-volt DC converter for your Yoda lamp. The future is lurking here all around us. The present is a moment of amplitude, discovery, and invention. And as I understand it, much of this is your job, right? So here is, this is the traditional grid, which I can't actually draw on this and show you, but what the idea is that you can have this traditional grid and add renewables into it without anything changing. And over and over and over again, we get this image of like, here's a coal burning power plant, here's a medium-sized power plant, which usually means natural gas, right? Here's an industrial plant, here's a nuclear plant. These are all on the transmission system, which then is located, these power plants are located far away from where you live. And the reason for this is largely pollution. So my grandmother, my family is from Chicago, and my grandmother, when she was a child and a young woman, used to talk about wiping every day before serving a meal, wiping the black coal dust off the table because the coal-fired power plant was just, you know, on the river actually, right? So just not far away. And we've moved all of those power plants really far away from urban centers. so that we can be free of the pollution that they cause in our immediate environment. And this has actually caused us in some ways not to notice the pollution that then goes up into the atmosphere. Then you see down on the second part, there's a city network, there's a rural network. On the other side, there's large commercial customers, and there's this like solar farm, wind farm thing that's happening. So this is an illusion because the solar and the wind are happening where the city network is, where the large commercial customers is, where the rural network is. It's not a separate thing that allows us to keep the system we've always had, but in fact, in the ways in which it's bringing electricity closer to where we live, and it's actually matching electricity quality to what we need, what individual customers need. It's beginning to revolutionize the grid, and that then allows for this meeting, essentially, of these small scale things happening inside the house, right? And these large scale changes that begin to come together. And you start to really see that when we talk about microgrids. So I have this last slide. I put 2020 in here because that's halfway between the 1970 grid and the 2070 grid. So I should move it slightly over to the right and call it 2021. But I like this halfway point. So what we had in 1970 were vertically integrated utilities as vertically integrated monopolies as the sole purveyors and sole purchasers of electricity. We had universal electrification. We had electricity made in bulk, far from where it's used, a heavy reliance on heat engines and fossil fuels, point-to-point long-distance transmission, we saw that in the picture, and then a dendritic lower voltage distribution system. I have to move the little box. In 2070, what we think we'll be seeing is generation and storage located where power is used and matched in the scale and power quality to usage. Consumption wildly optimized. Person-to-person energy trading as the norm. The Internet of Things. Possibly low voltage DC systems. Certainly dispatchable conservation. The total phase out of fossil fuels. And power to gas systems making green hydrogen that allow us to run things that we can't plug in, like airplanes and tankers. So this is where, from what we know now, where we're headed if we actually do want to, quote unquote, fix global warming. So with that, I hand it over to Professor Mohammad Shahidehpour, I'm sorry, I do my best, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the microgrid, so like the actual existing version of this sort of idea of the 7 meter. I don't know how many meters you have. You can have many more in a microgrid as it's being constructed at IIT.
Hi, Mohammad Shahidehpour is my name, as was pointed out, and we have been able to convert the entire university campus with 52 buildings to a microgrid. And this is sort of an aerial view of the entire campus. As you notice here, I don't know whether I can move as you see, we've got 2 substations, the north and the south. And substations are where we get connected to the local utility. And the power comes in at 12.47 kV. The entire campus is at 4160 volts. It's much smaller voltage. And the campus includes 7 loops, as it's demonstrated here. And as it was pointed out, we also have 3 nanogrids at the university. One is our sporting center, which is here. The other one is our data center. And the third one is actually our College of Architecture, which have converted to nanogrids. And the significance of a nanogrid is a system that can never lose power. So for instance, if this was a hospital campus, a nanogrid could be, let's say, a surgery department, which never could lose power. So we have equipped the 3 buildings with sufficient power in the form of solar and in some cases diesel backup, but plenty of storage. But the significance of that is that all three buildings are operated as AC/DC. So I'm a little more optimistic about the future of DC. I think it's going to happen sooner than later, primarily because a lot of loads that we have are DC. Your laptop is DC, your cell phone is DC, a lot of LED lights that we use are DC. So we are sort of migrating towards DC system. And also generation system is DC, like all those rooftop solar panels, they generate DC power. So for instance, in our sporting center, we've got two networks. One is a DC, the other one is AC. And the DC circuit is the one that connects the rooftop solar to all the LED lights within the building. And this is a purely DC circuit. And we still have some DC loads, like the pump that cleans the pool. So we've got the AC circuit for that as well. But our intention is to convert some of these buildings in the near future to solely DC system. And the reason it's possible is, as I pointed out, generation is DC and the load is DC. That's something that we couldn't do before, as it was pointed out, because a lot of large generators were located remotely from place of the load, from the cities, for various reasons. One was pollution that was pointed out. The other one was that a lot of hydro, rivers were not near a city, so we had to use large distances, but then the transmission had to be done at a high voltage because we had to reduce losses, ohmic losses along the line. So we used very high voltage, and those days transformers were all AC. But nowadays, generation is very close to the load, like in the roof of the building. So you really don't have to use a lot of transmission. It's all this low voltage distribution. So we can use the entire DC. So the campus that you see here, coming back to the campus, is that our peak load is about 12 megawatts. And we, most of the time, our average load is about 9 megawatt. Our total generation is about 10 megawatts. So basically, we are able to run the entire campus as an islandable microgrid throughout the year. The reason we don't do that is because we do day-ahead scheduling. So today we decide for tomorrow is what's the best way to operate this campus. And there are days and there are times which are much cheaper to buy electricity from the grid. So the hours which is cheaper to buy power from the grid, we buy the import power. The rest of the time we generate it ourselves. But it's an islandable campus. So in case of an emergency, we can open the switches at the two substations and the entire campus will be islanded. So if let's say if the city of Chicago or a neighborhood has a widespread outage and they're out of power, we can keep the lights on at the university. So I think you're going to see a lot more microgrids in the future, primarily because of the advent of DC, but also because the intention, as it was pointed out, is to convert the large grid to the grid of the grids. So a lot of small grids. So university, police station, hospitals, military installations, government buildings, they all could be operated as microgrids. And in all those cases, individual microgrids could have their own objective. For instance, here at IIT, our objective was reliability because we have a lot of students living on campus, we couldn't lose power. And in the case of a hospital, it could be a different objective. In case of a police station, another objective. And then you can bring all these microgrids together with different goals and objectives and types of generation, and then put the grid back together. So it's a great sort of news for the electricity, to the extent that we can have different objectives, we can have different costs and different buildings. We also, I spend quite a bit of time traveling to developing countries, underdeveloped countries, and we build microgrids. We do a lot of work in Asia, and also primarily do a lot of work in Africa, and places where people don't have any electricity. And we build these microgrids, and for those people, of course, the intention is just to have electricity available. And then we demonstrate how microgrids, an islanded system for a house or a village, can work and provide electricity to them. So I think, as she pointed out very elegantly, I think the future is very bright, but I think it's going to happen sooner than later, where we're going to have a grid that's a lot more reliable, a lot more sustainable, a lot more secure, a lot more resilient, and a lot more economical. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Mohammad and Gretchen, for these great comments, looking at two sides, right? So we have technical aspects, economic aspects, social aspects. So in my work, I have been focusing a lot in the last few years on food systems. And one of the things that strikes me in both of your comments has been about the transition from consumers really as being the recipients of what is given to us by a highly centralized, industrialized system, right? So they are generating the electricity that they anticipate consumers want based on statistics about timing. Similarly, right, our industrialized food system generates food products that it thinks we want. And in both cases, and what your talks highlight has been about really changing supply to match the demand and the needs of consumers, right? And so consumers changing their roles from being just a passive recipient of what's offered by the grid into kind of more actively thinking about, okay, how can I generate some of my own electricity to become self-sufficient, right? So we have those parallel conversations in the food world, right? So how can I grow some food in my own garden so I can become more self-sufficient and reduce the costs that I'm seeing there? And so I'm interested in kind of both your perspectives on how we make this transition. What are kind of the key barriers to prosumers, the role of prosumers becoming one that is more commonplace, right? And what are the kind of technical barriers, the economic barriers, the sociocultural barriers, and how do we make those transitions?
So what I think is, I feel like we see this pattern happening everywhere. What I think is really interesting about what you just said is that if we think about this hierarchical energy system, this what I call the 1970s grid, because it was sort of like that's when it reached maturity, right? And then we think about this grid of grids, as Mohammad said, or sort of this foam-like structure. The microgrid and the nanogrid are massive resources to a system which is nevertheless still providing affordable electricity universally to a given community, in this case, the nation, right? This is a decision that was made in the 1930s in the US that we would have universal electrification, even though poor people and rural people will never help anyone turn a profit. You can never make money selling electricity to poor people and rural people, but we're going to have this. This was a policy decision. So with something like a microgrid, you have this resource which is about producing for yourself, which is similar to a garden, right? A kitchen garden. But it's also a resource to the larger electricity system because it can withdraw demand when that system is under stress. So it's not just that the lights stay on when the larger grid breaks, but that it becomes a resource to a larger grid because it can, in fact, island itself and work well without that grid. And so my question is, how do we do that with food, right? Like, is there a way in which you have a parallel circulation of food within a community that actually changes the structures of, I'm just thinking of pig farms, like these massive pig farms, you know, like, is there something that can happen at the community level of exchange and growth and slaughter, right? That then disrupts the hierarchical system that's in place. Because what's been so remarkable with electricity is how revolutionary all of these changes have been, even though they're like creeping in, it's not like there was nobody that was like, here's the vision, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna lead the revolution in the electricity system. It's like, no, it's like all of these little things that are changing while we're using it, right? So I guess that's a question back to you.
If I may jump here on following on the same question that Weslynne, but shifting from more of the individuals, the communities, the people, and thinking about the role of buildings. So, so it's a non-human agent there, but what I'm seeing from what you're presenting and from what Mohammad's also presenting is that buildings will play a major different function. So for example, when I was thinking here through the presentation, there are a lot of discussion from your illustration that electricity comes to the house and the house is a box. So a lot of discussion about energy efficient buildings is this idea that the building is also just a consumer of energy. When we start thinking about the buildings as the one that can produce energy, or they can store energy and things like that, the building in itself, they also start to provide an environmental service. So buildings now, a single house or every building, it's also part of the grid and in terms of production and in terms of the environment, rather than just calculating footprint of a building, we're calculating their role. So I can imagine that a lot of consequence will be generated about that. Imagine how real estate will start to evaluate houses, not on the potential of just living. The same way that Airbnb changed the fact that I can rent my basement and I can make money out of that. I'm just imagining that now it's part of my portfolio. I'm producing energy. I have my room, my basement that I can rent. Certainly the home is a small enterprise that changed drastically because it's local market. So I'm interested on asking you, you mentioned this notion of new junctions for innovation, because it used to be like transmission of energy, production, transmission of energy, get into the home, that's a whole different environment. And you're saying that once we disrupt that, as Mohammad was presenting, we start to have new junctions of innovation and creativity. So from a design point of view, if we designers, we're not going to design the microgrid. When we start talking about creativity and innovation, where do we start? What are the places that you think that we should start as designers to be able to bring a contribution to the design of that future that is already a half century on the making?
Perhaps I can comment about rewriting. I think it is very important from a design point of view, and that has been a sort of an argument that we have with a lot of people who get into this field, is that as we look forward to a different grid, perhaps the grid of the grids, we need to redesign the entire system. In a sense, a lot of utilities, and the reason they sort of disregard a lot of new innovations is because they're trying to put these new designs on the old system, on the system that Edison started, and that will never work. It's like, imagine the cell phone system versus landline. You could not embed the cell phone system, the wireless technology, into the landline. The wireless technology is a completely different design. We now have two designs. We have a landline and we have a wireless technology. It's going to be the same thing when we talk about microgrids, nanogrids versus a traditional high voltage system. If you try to build this one as part of the other one, the system is going to completely fail. And that has been our practice. I want to also point out a couple other things. I mean, she asked about what are the issues with the future or basically the impediments. I guess the most critical one, I mean, from a design point of view, from engineering point of view, a lot of people have looked into a lot of solutions, and perhaps a lot of solutions are already there. One thing that's very critically missing is the issue related to policy, at least in the United States, in the sense that if there are two houses and they, like what Weslynne was pointing out, the presumers, one wants then power to the neighbors, you have to cross the wire that's owned by the utility. And they may not allow you to do that, to transact electricity. So the policies will have to change in order for these people, the consumers, to be able to transact electricity, to buy, sell, to basically exchange electricity. And until that policy changes, at least here in the United States, it's going to be a big, big issue that we may have to wrestle with for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think to follow up on that, I think that the issue of the relationship between state legislators and utilities means that utility change and politics are always very tightly bound to one another. And that can feel really stultifying. It can feel really hard to imagine how you can change any of that. And yet at the same time, we are changing it. And part of what I wanted to put forward in designing this talk, not from the typical conversation where we say, let's build renewables and then kind of see what happens, right? And lots of things have happened. I mean, in many ways, that's what the grid book is talking about, is like what happens when you do something very simple, like stop making power with coal and start making power with wind, right? There are all kinds of ramifications. But in many ways, the changes are also happening from these very, very small points upward. So it's not just some sort of funnel at the top that is like, oh, we change this and then it funnels down and then we reorganize the whole system. But actually there's always this push at, it can be the level of the socket, where you can see shifts happening. And this difference between what was expected of a USB cable in 2017 and what's expected of a USB cable today is absolutely phenomenal, right? Like you can't even imagine that 3 years, 4 years ago now, that something so stupid could actually exist as not having an adapter that you plug into your outlet to run a USB cable. So to pay some more attention, I think, to the way in which things are changing on this very small scale, and then to really look at, as you said, the you can be quite creative inside of a building, so that there are the critical junctures, right? The moment of ridiculous adapters. That's also just saying there are these critical junctures where things break down, where relations between what people are pushing forward and the system in its current state, they just don't work. They're not interoperable, right? And those are everywhere. And so from a design point of view, the question is, how do you find them? And I just gave you these ones that are like visually so extreme, right? Like, how do you find them? But then also, how do you play with them, right? Like, okay, you have this juncture outside your house that belongs to your house. The utility is not taking care of, they're taking care of the transformer, right? But the connection to your house, that's up to you, right? That's yours. Not just a house, it can be any kind of building, right? You don't have to own something to be a revolutionary these days. And I think that's really important too. So to not lose sight of the way in which these small things forgotten actually do form the ground for revolutionary systems change. In short, just look for crappy adapters. I would say, then fix them.
Just a quick comment here that I don't know if we have the time to expand too much on that, but I think the potential of something like that is also start to see the electric grid not only as infrastructure for power, electricity, but also as a civic infrastructure. The moment that people have the capacity of shaping their own home, community, neighborhood, and having ownership over their own resources, they are not just consumers. Now the electric grid is something that people are deciding as a community, and become a civic infrastructure. Like you own your own resources. Is a common resource that a community owns rather than a product that I buy. So I think that the shift there that's also going to open up, and I don't know what direction things will take, is that opportunity to think now the electric grid and the microgrid as a civic infrastructure, where cities and city councils is going to be deciding what do we want and how do we want and how we're going to use that, because they have ownership over that and they can construct that. So for me, that's a very interesting area to think ahead now that the engineering part is there, is to think about appropriation and envisioning of the grid as a civic infrastructure.
And I think this is really where sustainability comes to matter, right? So you're thinking about not just sustainability in terms of not pulling coal out of the ground or oil out of the ground and throwing it up into the atmosphere, right? That's one way of thinking of sustainability, but you also need to think about communities and families as things which should be sustained or should be sustainable, right? And that when you start to talk about civic infrastructure, you're pulling away from this scale of the planet and away from this sort of problem of the moment of global warming. And you're saying like, this is an opportunity for us to take stock of non-sustainable communities, right? And to figure out ways to build social justice into infrastructure. And I think that what's happening right now with electricity systems is open. It's just very open for that kind of move. And you see communities, rural co-ops are just doing amazing things. So it's not only urban communities, right? You see utilities, you see communities trying to figure out how to actually kind of take hold of the infrastructure and turn it in such a way that they still have affordable electricity, right, of high quality, but on different terms, right? On different terms that enables different kinds of community relations.
You know, one other thing that came up was the comparison between different infrastructures and like this comparison between electricity and food and all of that. One thing that makes electricity to be very different is the fact that we cannot store it in a very large quantities. You know, like if you have a commodity, let's say tea or coffee, if you cannot sell it all today, you can store it and bring it back and sell it tomorrow. In case of electricity, you can't do it because of the laws of the physics. Consumption and generation would have to be equal instantaneously. So in that respect, when you generate electricity, you have to consume it. And that makes it very different, let's say, from food or any other commodity in that respect. Now, shifting towards nanogrids or microgrids, because the batteries are more readily available at that scale, makes it a lot more easy, much easier basically, to utilize the system and be able to store what you generate. But overall, electricity is a very different commodity because of that issue.
Okay, great. I think we're going to move to audience questions now. We have some really good ones here. So, so off the top, one thing that maybe you know, both Mohammad and Gretchen could touch on is, Gretchen, maybe first, the culture of the sustainability movement. What are your thoughts in terms of how that culture of the sustainability movement is, how Paul has put it, how could they embrace small scale nuclear? Is that a possibility?
So nuclear is really one of the things, this is like speaking as an anthropologist, that you see particular communities accepting or rejecting on ethical grounds. So that I just saw a webinar from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and one of the people that was there was just like, nuclear is how it's going to be. It's going to be small nuclear, and that's just the way we're going to do it. And then there were a bunch of people there that were like, no, that's not how we're going to do it, because we're not going to have nuclear, right? And Germany, is where I live now, is just absolutely in a tizzy because they've shut down all their nuclear after Fukushima, and now they're trying to shut down all their coal plants. And this is just extremely difficult to do at the same time, but they're going to do it. Just next door, France, where I actually am right now, is 80% nuclear. So you see these very different relationships to the technology. Small nuclear is, viable in ways that big nuclear is not, but there are people pushing hard for other things because of the fear factor and the foreverness of the pollution if anything goes wrong. So I like Mohammed. I think that one of the most interesting things about electricity systems is that you can't really store electricity, right? It's just super hard to do. And so you get all of these, I don't know, I feel like people get extremely creative about it, but they also get extremely emotionally attached to it and very confused about how things actually work. And nuclear just sort of falls right into the middle of that and becomes a giant boxing match for what comes next. So Mohammed might have a better idea. I expect that there will be quite a lot of small nuclear in the US. I think that's probably one of the things that's going to end up happening. But there certainly isn't going to be any in Austria or in Germany. And they'll be able to they'll figure out ways to run their just-in-time grid without it. And that's where the creativity comes in. Like you have to make the electricity somehow, you have to use it somehow, but you get to decide as a community how that will be done. Community being, it could be the south side of Chicago, it could be Illinois, it could be the Midwest, it could be the US, it could be North America, right? Like there's all of these different scales at which community matters.
The problem with renewable energy like solar and wind is that they are very intermittent. Basically, sun doesn't shine all the time, wind doesn't blow all the time. So you need to look into other means of basically generating electricity. But one thing that should not be disregarded is the customer participation, in the sense that a lot of times loads are controllable as well. So if we can make the loads follow the pattern of, let's say, solar or wind, then we can solve a lot of problems. But definitely, as she pointed out, we cannot rely 100%, and the subject of nuclear gets to be very, very important if we totally want to get away from thermal energy. So I think I'm basically fossil fuel. So I think nuclear is going to be the way of the future. But I also, as I said, I also believe that the role of the customers and the controllable load and customer participation and demand response is going to be significant as we move into microgrids and nanogrids.
Yeah, and just imagine, like, if you didn't have a fridge, the fridge was invented to create nighttime load on the electric fridge on an electric grid, because a fossil fuel power plant needs to actually be making about the same amount of electricity 24 hours a day. So things had to be created that would use that electricity in order for the power plant to run at the same level 24 hours a day. If you get rid of your fridge, or you think differently about the fridge, or you redesign the fridge, you can actually turn your electricity off at night. You don't need electricity at night. You go to bed, you say, turning off the electricity, clack on the thing or on your phone or whatever, and you turn it on again in the morning. So there you have something, that's a great example for Carlos. There you have something that is holding a fossil fuel, a little thing that's holding a fossil fuel system in place, right? And if you pull that little thing out, you get rid of your nighttime load. Now, oh, maybe it's an electric car. Okay, how do we deal with that, right? Like, new problem. How do we pull that thing out? But then using solar becomes a lot easier in places that are really sunny, because you just need 4 or 5 hours of storage, which you can do with salt, molten salt. And then
What
to bed.
What is this opening up for me is an interesting perspective that not only we're going to be thinking about the grid as something that change the way that we consume energy, and we can think about the patterns of daily life, but if we also integrate with the systems of data. And I think there's one question, someone that was making that question, like the integration of the grid from the point of view of generating electricity, but also generating the data. So I think that if we, the traditional thing it was, if we provide electricity, now you have light at night, you can stay longer at night, you can work at night, and you can work in a dark day. So all those things like change it, the rhythm of how things happen. But it seems that now people can adapt, meaning collect data about how they do things, and from that generate the electricity that they need for that. So it could be a kind of a behavior change system where we are learning about people's behavior and the electricity that is needed for that, and a kind of a learning process where you're interacting with your environment, and if you start changing, you also consume in different ways. So depending on the time that you're going to work, the time that you go to, and so it has flexibility. So it's not about predetermining, but something that I want to change. What is the best way of changing? And so I'm seeing kind of two convergence between information technology and information systems with the flexibility of the grid, that one is going to inform the other. And this will shape new patterns of behavior. Like the Fitbit that informs you if you're doing exercise, how much you want to move and how much you're eating. This also is going to give you potential ways of thinking about ways of using the home and working and using electricity. That's also going to reshape. I'm just playing around, and it was a great question from the audience, bringing this issue that the interconnectivity with the data system also open up entire new possibilities.
Yeah, on that same note, we have a couple of questions from the audience, which ask sort of about the regulatory end of things, and developing like a universal code. Are those ways that like design might want to approach this, or in fact would it be, is that part of the problem, part of the solution, and or how might you address it with what you were just talking about, Carlos? Maybe with behavioral ways of approaching things. Just want to answer sort of these interesting questions from the audience about the role of regulation in a civic infrastructure like this. I don't know, Weslynne or Carlos, do you have any thoughts there?
The first thing that comes to my mind is just to play with history. And I'm not someone that is very familiar with regulatory systems and policy making. So but I'm thinking how disruptive people's behavior will become up to the point that policy and regulation will have to change. So Mohammad was saying that you cannot transmit energy from one home to the other. I'm just imagining that in a certain community, and I have my brother living in the close home, or my parents, what's going to stop me to connect the cable from one to the other once I can do that connectivity? It's just the regulatory stuff. It's like I can be a hacker and do that. So until people start to police or control that, but I can imagine that people are going to be hacking a lot of those things. And typically what happens is that people hack until a crisis emerges. So for example, you get a fire, and then people realize that all the houses in the neighborhood, they have those illegal wires going on, like the one that you show, like the one outside of the street, like going the outside of the street. So I think it's going to be kind of precedents that's going to establish things like that, or people visionary that's going to look at that and say it's time to provide a new marketplace, a new structure, a new policy, and that would open up entire new possibilities for people to get there. But I imagine that those things, as always, is going to happen top down and bottom up. The question is more, what is the tipping point where those things are going to turn from one to the other one? But from a design perspective, I'm thinking more about the crisis that we designers are going to create once we start to create innovations that regulation is not ready for that yet.
Great. And then just lastly, we have a couple of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of the audience questions, unfortunately, today, but we have a couple of questions that kind of circulate around like the role of or the importance of convenience when you look to redesigning a system such as this, the role of convenience and the role of the climate emergency in doing that. And so I wonder, Carlos, if you could maybe answer that by talking a little bit about like how your class's workshop will be kind of looking at this situation.
Thank you. And just to add more to the comment that I was making before, the examples that I was going to give is like Uber and Airbnb. Those are things that happens at the edge of those regulations, and then everybody has to deal with that. Like, it's not illegal, but I'm not collecting tax. I'm not. So it goes all those things that until they get a tipping point and where cities start to regulate that. So that's one thing. In terms of the convenience, I think that what we have to really, for me, when it comes to be civic infrastructure, and all of you could help me here on trying to answer that question. I think the question there is about equity. It's about how much this is really something that is a privilege or something that everybody has equal access and opportunities around that. So I think that convenience, it's very focused on the fact that we need to make it very user-friendly. So it's a very human-centered approach. So it's easy to use, it's accessible. The example of Airbnb and kind of Uber. But I think that this doesn't mean that it's equitable because people that don't have a home, they cannot rent. So they are not taking a share in this marketplace of ride sharing and home sharing. So I think that we need to have a different perspective of thinking more about infrastructures that are civic infrastructures, but they take the notion that they also discriminatory on the way that they perform. So if you want to invest on that, you have to have credit. Not everybody has access to credit. So in the workshop that we are doing is the Sustainable Solution Workshop is this semester. And we are working on thinking about the microgrid as a civic infrastructure. And we are bringing all those issues of sustainability, equity, and governance as issues that should be at the core of imagining this kind of future. So yeah, we're gonna run that through the semester, and by May we will have the results of our workshop. I'm very excited to see what the students will bring up from that work. But I would let also Weslynne and all the other ones try to answer a little bit of that question about the convenience.
I would actually like to say something about regulation, which is that regulation is exhausting. And I feel like so much of the push since the 1970s against various kinds of holders of power, people push hard at it, and there are moments at which there's a crack and a lot of things change. But it's exhausting work. To do that, it's boring to try to understand regulation. And yet, inside of companies, inside of utilities, inside of organizations like IIT, there are people who are also trying to change things. And there's been a lot of talk in the discussion about global warming about how you promote these people. You know, how you get the forward thinkers that are already inside of, you know, a regulatory body, inside of a legislative body, and you get those people to be in conversation with each other so that they know everything. Like, it's impossible to understand what the regulations are for your particular, you know, neighborhood of a big city in terms of electrical infrastructure. It's just too much work to actually ask an individual person to do. And so you get, in the US, you get very uneven change because of this, because there are forward thinkers of different types in different places, but also because there's different resources in different places. So for example, in Florida, there's almost no solar. In Vermont, there's a ton of solar. And it's because the relationship, even though in Florida, there should be a ton of solar, right? In Vermont, not any. But it's not based on the sun, right, as being the resource there, but it's based on a relationship between utilities and communities and regulatory bodies that moves in certain very forward-thinking ways in Vermont and really digs in its heels in Florida. And I think we should give like credit in some way to people who don't want to think about regulation and governance of the electricity system, even though we need to change regulation and governance of the electricity system. This is just not something that everybody needs to know about in all of the detail. Support the forward thinkers, like support the people in there, and like get them to talk to each other and become powerful and to change things in this way.
And a quick comment to Gretchen, and I will let Wesley build on that, is the idea that design can help on that. Not that we're going to design regulations because we are not qualified to do that, but creating envisioning the livelihoods of communities with microgrids allows people to imagine what kind of policies and regulations I need to put in place so that this kind of livelihoods could emerge. So that's a role for designers. And I think Weslynne has worked on the federal government on things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in without repeating too much of what has been said, is that I see the potential for lots of new product design that meet needs that many in kind of the Western, North American, Western European spaces are not currently facing, right? And so in this conversation, I'm thinking about the development of apps like M-Pesa in Kenya, right? Which is mobile money transfer payment system for paying people who don't have access to a bank, right? And so if we think about the either a microgrid or kind of what might be new products that really meet the needs of those who are very marginalized in communities around the world, then those innovations can be a space for thinking about, okay, well, what type of electricity, what type of power do we need, right? And kind of harking back to, something Mohammad was saying about, like, do we need more DC type power supplies that can match the demand for a new product? So we don't have to tap into a microgrid, right? We don't have to tap into an AC system, but that there can be a standalone matching of power supplied with the need based on the product itself, right? And so, my take here is, like, let's think about where there are significant needs, new products that match the needs of marginalized communities, and then think about how we could redesign power systems to meet those needs.
That's very important because two elements that are usually left out in these kind of conversations is one is the subject of psychology, and the other one is social science. And these two elements play such a significant role in what we're discussing, in the sense, as we are moving forward, understanding the way people think and the way people use electricity, and be able to adjust that is going to be so critical. So, and one other thing is that the system that you designed, let's say for Chicago, is going to be very, very different from the system that you designed, let's say, in a city in Africa. Because people live differently, because people have different mentalities. So basically, you need to, when we move to, let's say, microgrids and nanogrids and localized systems, you need to consider social behavior and the interests of people who live in that area. So you cannot take the design that was done, let's say, in New York, and take it to somewhere in Southeast Asia and assume that it's going to be optimized in that location as well if it was optimized in New York. So the role of social science, psychology, and customer behavior is going to be significant.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I think we are way over time here, so I just want to close. I don't know if anyone has sort of a last note, but I know that what we had talked about earlier is how integral, the people aspect of this is. There's the technical aspects and the systems that are at play here, and then always considering the people. And as Mohammad was just talking about, that that is different from place to place. Gretchen, did you have anything you wanted to end on?
I mean, I think electricity grids are always local, even if it's a standardized voltage that's coming out of the, out of the outlet. And that Mohammad is absolutely right to think about what the resources are in a given place, what the hardships are in a given place. Like, it's very different to design an electricity system for some place with a grid than it is to design an electricity system for a place without a grid, right? But you have problems in both cases, and you have local values in both cases. And I think that even something as simple as having a hill or not having a hill, or having a lake or not having a lake, can make a giant difference to the kinds of resources that are available to constructing a fossil-free electricity grid. And I think that that's something that we really need to pay attention to, is that the goal here is to get the fossil fuels out of the grid, and that the design problems flow from that. And once that policy is put in place, or once carbon is priced up so high that that fossil fuels will simply begin to not be worthwhile because it's cheaper, renewables are cheaper, that there's just going to be a blossom of opportunity, right? And that opportunity is technological, and it's also social.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. And as we mentioned early on, this has been recorded, and we'll share it out tomorrow via email. And thanks again to all our panelists today, and Gretchen for starting us off. And
I have a last slide.
Great, perfect. All right, we'll end it there. Thanks all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Absolutely lovely.
Thanks.